So, I'm sitting here on a Sunday in New York doing the most boring, normal thing imaginable, trying to ignore markets for 5 minutes. And I wasn't even going to make this video. I really wasn't. Then I checked one silver chart, pulled up one positioning update, and thought, how are people still being fed the same bedtime story while the plumbing is doing backflips? Because if you own silver, trade silver, or even just watch silver, what just happened matters a lot. And here's the wild part. The whole thing didn't even start with charts. It started with a rant, like full-on, pay me my silver energy. Then the speaker says he just dropped a behind-the-scenes discussion with someone named Jenny Moonstone. And he frames it like, okay, now we're finally talking about the financial side of that infamous scandal. And according to him, Jenny had this theory from a few years back that basically goes, silver doesn't truly break free until a much bigger corruption story collapses. He ties it to trafficking networks, elite protection, and the idea that the real power is financial, not political. Now, I'm not asking you to adopt that worldview. I'm telling you it matters, because that's the emotional engine behind a lot of silver content right now. It's not just, I think the metal is undervalued. It's, I think the entire scoreboard is morally corrupt. And once that's the mindset, every price smash feels personal. It's Sunday, February 8th, New York time. Comment what day and date you're watching from. And quick thing before we go down this rabbit hole, I'm running a campaign to eliminate copycat channels. If you value what I do here, support it by subscribing and commenting "You're Mick AG" so the algorithm knows who's real. Now I'm going to say something that will make a lot of people mad, and that's fine. The price of silver you see on a screen is not the same thing as the value of silver in your hand. Those are two different games. One is a global scoreboard where paper contracts bounce around at the speed of light. The other is the slow, stubborn world of actual metal, actual inventory, actual delivery deadlines, and actual do you have it or don't you moments. And when the scoreboard gets punched hard enough, everybody starts screaming manipulation, or everybody starts screaming free market. And usually both sides are missing the point, because the only question that matters is, who had to move? And why did they have to move right then? And by the way, if you've been watching the silver community lately, you know the vibe. People aren't politely asking anymore. They're basically pounding the table like, stop playing games, deliver the metal, pay up in silver right now. Some people even take it a step further with that dramatic line like, pay me or somebody should go to jail. That's the emotional temperature. That anger doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from years of watching paper trades dwarf what's sitting in a warehouse and feeling like the physical world is being bullied by the financial world. So I went looking for the footprints because the market doesn't confess with words, it confesses with footprints. And based on recently published numbers, you can actually see something important. A big chunk of open interest basically vanished in a single reporting window. That doesn't happen because everyone suddenly found inner peace. That happens because somebody got forced to dump positions, somebody chose to run away, or somebody got paid to step aside. Now here's what set me off. We just watched one of those violent blink and you miss it silver episodes where it feels like a truck hits the market, everything caves in, and then it bounces like nothing happened. The kind of day where your chart looks like a heart monitor in a bad movie, and the chatter afterward is always the same. It's fake, it's rigged, it's a trap. Maybe. But if you want to understand whether it's rigged, stop staring at the candlesticks and start staring at positioning and settlement. Because the chart is the noise. The positioning is the confession. Now, before I get into the bank positioning, I want to clear up a confusion that keeps getting people spun up. There are different reports people cite, and they are not the same thing. The weekly commitment style report is a snapshot of categories. It's useful, but it's delayed, and it's broad. The bank participation style data is different. It breaks out bank exposure in its own way, and it can tell a different story depending on how you read it. So when you hear someone say, the banks are doing this, your first question should be, which data set are you using and what exactly does it measure? Because a lot of people are taking a fuzzy picture and drawing a crisp conclusion, and that's dangerous. Still, even with that caution, the footprints this time are not subtle. Yes, banks did flip. At least the reporting suggests a meaningful swing in how the big U.S. bank category is positioned in silver futures and options. But here's the part people don't slow down enough to explain. A bank being net short does not automatically mean the bank is bearish. A bank being net long does not automatically mean the bank is bullish. Banks aren't like you and me. They're not sitting there with one little brokerage account going, I feel lucky today. They're running books that include clients, hedges, financing, swaps, and sometimes a whole zoo of offsets that never show up in the headline numbers. So if you're going to point a finger, you better do it with care. And still, the timing is what's fascinating, because the swing people are talking about is not a tiny wiggle. It's the kind of shift that makes you sit up. Roughly speaking, We're not talking about a few hundred contracts. We're talking about a move that translates into tens of millions of ounces worth of exposure when you convert it using the usual contract math. And again, I'm rounding because the exact figures bounce week to week. And the point isn't the third decimal place. The point is the direction and the size. So the basic story goes like this. The US bank bucket looked a bit on the long side not long ago. Then it looks meaningfully short now. And at the same time, the non-US bank bucket looks like it has been shrinking a very large short exposure. And the names people keep attaching to that non-US bank short story are familiar. One big London-based player that shows up in a lot of metals conversations, and another big European institution that people love to point at as the next domino. I'm not going to pretend I can prove which exact bank did what from a category label, but the broader point stands. Foreign banks looked heavily short, then less heavily short. That combination is where the internet goes, aha, bailout. And I get why that's tempting. Because if a big foreign bank is stuck short and the market is rising, the easiest movie script is that a big US bank comes in, absorbs risk, and everybody quietly walks away from the burning building. It's a clean narrative. Too clean. So here's my counterpoint. It might not be a bailout, it might be a reshuffle. It might be the kind of risk transfer that happens all the time in derivatives markets when one set of players decides the cost of carrying a position is no longer worth it, and another set of players decides the volatility premium is delicious. That's not the same thing as saving anyone. That's just business. But I'm also not going to pretend it's nothing. Because if you combine that positioning shift with what happened on the tape, you get a very uncomfortable question. Who knew the trapdoor was about to open? Now, there's another detail in the competitor narrative that a lot of people miss, and it's actually important. They keep pointing at customer accounts like, oh, it's not the house book anymore, it's the customer book. If that's true, that's not some tiny accounting detail. That is a major optics move. Because if a position sits in a house account, everyone assumes the bank is taking risk directly. If it sits in a customer bucket, now you can shrug and go, hey, that's not us, that's a client. But here's the problem. A bank doesn't just magically stop influencing a market because it labels something customer. If the bank is the clearing hub, the financing hub, the prime brokerage hub, and the options market maker, it can still shape flows even if the risk is technically tied to client activity. So when you hear customer dominates, don't translate that as the bank is innocent. Translate it as the system is layered and accountability gets blurry by design. And that's exactly why silver creates rage. Because the rage isn't just about price, it's about responsibility. Now we have to talk about electronic silver. Look, I hate that phrase. It's dramatic. It makes it sound like someone printed metal on a laser printer. But the underlying point is real. The notional amount of silver that can change hands in the paper market in a day can be enormous compared to the amount of metal that actually moves in a warehouse. And when liquidity is thin, when stops are clustered, when the market is leaning the same way, you can absolutely get a move that feels like it was engineered, even if it was just an avalanche of mechanical selling and hedging. If you watched the tape on that Thursday, February 5th, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The move down was fast. The bounce back was faster than it should have been. And that's why people keep repeating the same claim. There were a few billion notional paper ounces thrown at it. Are they exaggerating? Probably. Are they pointing at something real? Also probably, because even if you cut the number in half or cut it to a third, you're still talking about a mountain of paper exposure compared to the physical market's daily rhythm. And here's the part that's going to mess with your head. Even if every single trade is legal, the structure itself can still produce outcomes that look insane. That's the first big hook of silver. The market can be legitimate and still feel illegitimate. Now the second hook is even worse, delivery month. Most people ignore delivery month until it bites them. And the competitor story includes a very specific kind of allegation that a big player stood for delivery in a size that looked like it blew past what many traders think of as a typical cap. Here's the clean way to say it without theatrics. Futures exchanges have position limits and accountability levels, especially around spot months. For silver, a commonly referenced number is in the mid-1,000 contracts range for the spot month limit, depending on the contract and the rules in force. But the word limit makes people assume it's a hard wall. Sometimes it is. Sometimes there are exemptions, spreads, bona fide hedge classifications, and other mechanisms that can make what looks like a violation to the public into something that is technically permitted. That doesn't mean it's good, it doesn't mean it's fair, it just means it might be allowed. So, when someone waves a screenshot and screams, "They broke the rules," the grown-up question is, Did they actually break the written rule, or did they exploit the rule book the way professional players always do? And then there's the other mechanism people keep bringing up, usually with a lot of confusion: exchange for physical. Here's the simple version. Sometimes futures exposure gets swapped out for a different form of settlement, often tied to the London market. It can be used for legitimate hedging and inventory management, and it can also be used to move pressure off the visible exchange footprint. So when people say they got out without buying, what they may be describing is not a magic trick. It may be a settlement path that moves the problem somewhere less visible. And that's why some traders keep pointing at London whenever New York gets weird. Now, does that prove manipulation? No. It proves the market has multiple doors, and you're only watching one of them. And that brings us to the regulator. Because in a week like this, everyone wants an adult in the room. The CFTC is supposed to be part of that adult supervision for U.S. derivatives markets. The commission is designed to have a full slate of commissioners, but in real life, it often runs with vacancies, transitions, acting leadership, and political delays. And yes, I saw the chatter about the chair. The rant throws out a name like it's a villain reveal, and then the guy basically says, "Why is this office asleep while the market is going nuts?" Now, whether you agree or not, it's worth knowing this. Recent reporting has covered the agency's leadership change, along with broader criticism about enforcement direction. That assumption might be wrong. A lot of enforcement is quiet, slow, and boring. It happens months later. It happens in letters. It happens in settlements. It happens when nobody's paying attention. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Slow enforcement is emotionally useless in a fast market, and that's why this detail matters. The regulator story is changing in real time. The rant you're hearing goes, "Nobody's there," and then it zooms in on the chair like it's a character in a movie. The guy even jokes that the chair's profile photo wasn't up yet. Then he says the name out loud, pauses, and goes on this random tangent about dating someone with the same last name back in college. It's messy, it's human, and it's also a signal. People don't trust the referee. But here's the thing. Even if you don't trust the referee, you still need to know what the rulebook and the enforcement environment look like. Because from recent regulatory coverage, the CFTC has been under pressure about staffing priorities and enforcement pace. And there's been public reporting that enforcement actions and penalties have cooled compared with the prior year. That doesn't prove anybody is letting manipulation happen. It does mean the incentives shift. Also, leadership matters. A new chair can signal a new tone, but there's always a lag. Markets move today. Investigations move next season. That gap is where conspiracy narratives breed, and where smart people start trusting vibes over facts. If you're a big player and you feel like the spotlight is dimmer, you test the edges more. That's just how markets work. Now stack that on top of what's happening in the physical world, and this is where it gets spicy. Because based on recent market reporting, silver hasn't just been volatile, it's been disorderly. The kind of disorder where paper and physical start acting like two different species. There have been sessions lately where silver ripped higher so fast it printed triple-digit headlines. And the story underneath wasn't, "Everybody suddenly loves jewelry." It was tightness. It was logistics. It was inventory moving. And it was fear that certain supply channels could get pinched. And when that happens, you start seeing odd behavior. Metal shifting into U.S. warehouses. Talk about shortages in one location while another location looks fine. And people paying up for immediate delivery even when the paper price on a screen looks calm. That's the moment when the market stops being academic. That's the moment when short sellers don't just close the trade. They have to choose a door. Do they buy it back in the open market? Do they deliver? Do they swap the obligation somewhere else? And if enough players rush the same door at the same time, you get exactly what we just saw. A slam down, a snap back, and a whole lot of people pretending it was normal. So people fill the silence with stories, and then those stories spread in a way that is getting harder and harder to untangle because the content ecosystem itself is changing. There are a lot of experts online now who don't have to be real. You can put an AI face on a channel, give it a confident voice, feed it charts, and it will sound convincing enough to move people's emotions. So when you see a guru confidently explaining why the banks did this, ask yourself, do you even know who you're listening to? And that matters because misinformation doesn't just waste your time, it pushes you into bad trades. Now I'm going to pivot into the next ingredient from the competitor narrative, and this is where things get sensitive. The documents, the scandal gravity, the idea that nothing will happen until a certain set of court documents comes out. Let's be careful here. There is a real, documented reason people bring up a certain infamous name whenever they talk about big banks and accountability, because there have been major legal actions, settlements, and court proceedings involving the relationship between that person and major financial institutions, including allegations about what was known and when. Recent court reporting has covered a settlement in the hundreds of millions range tied to claims around that relationship. And yes, there are huge stacks of documents in those cases. Tens of thousands of pages, memos, emails, transfers, names blacked out, names not blacked out, and a whole lot of uncomfortable questions. The competitor story even zooms in on specific-looking memos with specific dates, like a transfer instruction for around $1 million or a money market purchase in the low tens of millions and then a sweep a week later. Now, I'm not here to play detective on those individual pages, but I am here to point out why people latch on to them. Because when the public sees big numbers move casually in internal paperwork, it creates a gut-level belief that rules are optional for certain circles, and then silver becomes the symbol. Not because silver is secretly magical, because silver is one of the few assets regular people can hold and say, this isn't somebody's promise, this is a thing. Now here's the key distinction. A big document dump is not the same thing as a proven story. Documents can contain allegations. They can contain internal debates. They can contain ugly facts. They can also contain noise. So if you're going to use documents as your proof of a silver conspiracy, you're skipping steps. However, and this is important, the documents do something else that absolutely does matter for markets. They change the public's trust calculus. If people look at filings and think the rules are different for them, then every market move becomes suspect. And now we're back to derivatives. And yes, the derivatives numbers are staggering. According to the latest publicly available banking derivatives data, the notional amounts sitting inside the U.S. banking system are not big. They are planet-sized. We're talking well over $200 trillion in notional value across the system, with a huge share concentrated in a small handful of the largest banks. Quick correction before someone clips me. Notional is not the same as risk. If you have a swap on one side and an offsetting swap on the other side, the notional number looks enormous, but the net exposure might be far smaller. So when someone says they have tens of trillions, therefore they can control everything, that's sloppy. But when someone says the system is so interconnected and so concentrated that it's fragile, that's not sloppy. That's a reasonable read. And here's the fresh context that a lot of silver channels weirdly avoid. We have literal precedent for manipulation in these markets. A few years back, major enforcement actions described spoofing behavior in precious metals markets, with huge penalties and detailed descriptions of how deceptive order placement can distort prices. So when someone tells you manipulation is impossible, that's not true. It has happened. But spoofing is not the same thing as total control. Spoofing can nudge and jerk and fake liquidity. It does not give someone God mode over the entire silver price forever. So we have to hold both ideas in our head at once. Yes, bad actors exist. Yes, complex markets can still move violently without a single villain. Now, let's talk about the part of the story that is actually bullish, and nobody wants to admit it because it's less exciting than yelling. Silver is not just a metal people hoard. Silver is also inside the technology stack, power distribution, electronics, solar, data centers, all of it. And multiple industry reports have been pointing out that solar and electrification trends can keep a real bid under industrial silver demand for years, even as manufacturers try to economize and reduce usage per unit. From recent market updates, silver had an explosive run-through last year with big gains that even the mainstream precious metals crowd didn't expect. So, if you want a fresh, non-conspiracy explanation for why the paper market gets so violent, here it is. When an asset becomes both a macro trade and an industrial trade, leverage shows up. When leverage shows up, the market becomes a room full of stacked dominoes. And then all you need is one shove. That shove can be a headline. That shove can be a margin change. That shove can be a liquidation in something else that forces funds to sell whatever they can. And once the dominoes start, people mistake the fall for a mastermind. Sometimes there is a mastermind. Sometimes there's just a badly designed room. Now the competitor script pulls a pivot that is both clever and dangerous. It goes from silver is manipulated to, and therefore buy this token, and here's a geopolitical nightmare. Fear then funnel. That's an old playbook, and I'm not even saying the technology they mention is useless. Let's talk about it like adults. Theta is a project that positions itself around decentralized video delivery and edge computing using a dual token design, where one token is tied to governance and staking, and another token is used for network operations and rewards. That's real. That's what it says on the tin. Does that mean it saves the world? No. That's marketing. Does it mean it's automatically a band-aid for a chip shock? Also no. That's a leap. But the geopolitical risk they're pointing at is not imaginary. The Taiwan semiconductor question is one of the most obvious single points of failure in modern supply chains. Even mainstream reporting has been tracking how companies and governments are trying to diversify production, including new manufacturing partnerships and new capacity plans outside Taiwan. And the U.S. build-out story is real. There have been new deals and public announcements aimed at expanding chip production domestically, even if it takes years to scale and even if it doesn't replace Taiwan overnight. So when someone says, if Taiwan goes dark, we're set back a decade, I understand the fear behind it, but here's the skeptical lens. Even if you had the best decentralized edge network on Earth, it doesn't conjure lithography machines out of thin air. It doesn't replace specialized tooling. It doesn't rebuild a supply chain overnight. So the honest version of that pitch is not, this fixes chips. The honest version is, in a world where bandwidth, compute, and delivery are stressed, networks that can tap idle capacity might help in specific use cases. That's it. And if someone can't sell you the honest version, you should ask yourself why they need the dramatic version. Now, the competitor story also does something else that I hate. It tells people basically, you don't know anything unless you're the one clicking the mouse. That message is poison because it makes people fatalistic. It makes people think learning is pointless. And that's exactly how scammers thrive. So here's my message instead. You can learn enough to stop being the easy prey. You can learn enough to recognize when a market is over-leveraged. You can learn enough to spot when narratives are being used as bait. And if you're successful, share your success story in the comments so others can stay motivated. Now, 2 questions for you because I actually want to know where you're at. Do you think this latest silver whiplash was mostly a mechanical liquidation or mostly a strategic flush by big players? And second, what matters more to you, the paper price on a screen or the availability and premiums in the physical market where real metal changes hands? Drop your take in the comments. I read them, and the best comments teach other people. Now let's zoom out one more layer, because this is the part almost nobody connects. When trust breaks, people run to hard assets. When volatility spikes, people run to stories. And when stories get too wild, people stop seeing the real risks, like leverage, liquidity, and concentration. Concentration always looks efficient until it snaps. So what do you do with that? First, don't confuse outrage with analysis. Outrage is a spark. Analysis is a flashlight. Second, don't outsource your brain to a chart screenshot. If someone shows you a position number and tells you it proves a grand plan, ask what else could explain it. Client hedging, producer hedging, ETF rebalancing, options dealers managing gamma, spread trades rolling, EFP-type transfers into off-exchange settlement, and yes, occasionally somebody leaning on the market. Third, watch the next reporting windows, because if this was a one-off liquidation, positioning will normalize. If this was a deliberate reset, you'll see patterns repeat, rising volatility, shrinking open interest, and the same handful of categories swinging again and again in the public data. And fourth, be honest about what you're actually trying to do. Are you trying to trade this? If yes, then your risk is not silver fundamentals. Your risk is getting caught in a stampede. Are you trying to hold this as a long-term hedge? If yes, then your risk is not the daily candle. Your risk is sizing too big and getting shaken out emotionally at the worst possible moment. And that is why I keep coming back to one boring rule, position size. If you can't sleep, you're too big. Now last thing, and then I'll let you go. The competitor narrative tries to tie everything to one villain and one redemption arc. One villain in banking, one villain in regulation, one villain in geopolitics, and then one shiny solution. That's entertainment. Reality is messier. Reality is that markets are complex systems where incentives matter, rules matter, and the plumbing matters. Reality is that sometimes the villain is just leverage interacting with a thin order book. And reality is that if there is manipulation, it rarely looks like a cartoon. It looks like a series of small advantages, quietly taken over and over by players who can survive longer than you can. So keep your eyes on the data, keep your emotions out of it, and keep calling out the copycats so the real work doesn't get drowned out. Subscribe if you want more of these deep dives, and comment "You're Mick AG" if you're with me on cleaning up this space. This is for educational purposes only. I'm sharing how I think about market structure, public reports, and risk. I'm not telling you what to buy or sell, and I'm not your financial advisor. Make your own decisions.